Welcome back to the Garden Hutch. Today we're going to discuss the what, where, how, and why of the tomatoes we're growing this year. Let's get going. So it is no secret to anybody that watches this channel that tomatoes are my favorite vegetable. In fact, tomatoes are the reason I started gardening in the first place. One of our strategies here on the homestead to make sure that I get ample tomatoes during the growing season is to spread them out throughout all of our garden areas. So today I thought it would be fun and kind of go through all of our gardens and show you what kind of tomatoes we're growing them, how we're growing, and what we're going to use them for. Let's go take a look. So we will start here in the pallet garden, and these are what we call our bulk tomatoes. We'll start down here in this bed, and this is the Roma tomato bed. You can see we only planted 6 this year, and we're using these bamboo stakes that we cut from the property. Try to save as much money as we can. The reason we're using stakes for these is because they're a determinate variety, so they're not going to get incredibly tall or anything. We also like to use the stakes because it saves us quite a bit of money whenever it comes right down to it. The beef masters, which are up there and we'll look at here in a minute, they have to support a little bit more weight, so we actually use the tomato cages. But because of the way we tie our Roma tomatoes, we don't necessarily need that. So you can see here, there's quite a bit of space. What we'll do is we'll go through with some of our oak leaf mold that we made over the fall, and we'll just cover the bottom of this bed. We were waiting for a big rain to come through, and it just so happens that that big rain happened to stop right before I made this video. So the next time you see the Romas and the Beef Masters, they will have the leaf mold on the bottom. Let's step up here and look at the Beef Master tomatoes. Now again, as I stated, you can tell these are obviously growing in the tomato cages. Again, the reason for that is just the weight that the limbs themselves have to support. These will probably get a little bit taller than the Roma tomatoes. So what I'll do is you see I kind of situated these where I have a runner in the back side of the cage. What I'll do is when the time comes, I will stick a piece of bamboo down there and I'll measure it out to about 6 foot or so. I don't want to do it because we have to keep this netting on here until they get big or the chickens will fly in there and eat the baby plants. So once that happens, I can put a taller stake in, and as the Beef Master continues to grow up, we'll tie it, the main stem of it, to the actual bamboo stake itself, and then we'll allow the cage to support the heavy fruit as they go. Now Beef Masters, we slice these and eat them with almost every dinner. I love sliced tomatoes as a side item. So during the summertime when we're barbecuing a lot, or we're trying to make sure we cook as little as possible in the house, we'll eat these sliced tomatoes, and they very rarely will we have any extra to give away because I eat so many of them. So just a note, last year we grew both the Roma tomatoes and the Beef Master tomatoes in the top garden. We decided to move them to the pallet garden this year because they seem to get a little bit more sun. We also like the idea of them having just a bit more root exposure to the compost that we put in the beds. If it works out well, we'll keep them there. If not, we'll move them back to the top garden. You know, these beds are only a couple years old, so we're still trying to find what grows best and where. But speaking of the top garden, let's go look at those tomatoes real quick. In this bed, we are growing cherry tomatoes this year. Last year, this was the Beef Master bed, and we got a lot of slicing tomatoes last year from this bed. Because we grew large tomatoes in it last year, I went through and I made sure to amend all of the compost that was already in there. I also added several inches of new compost, and I gave it a boost with a little bit of blood and bone meal and some Epsom salt. All of the, little macro things and micro things that tomatoes need to thrive. I didn't think it was really fair to put our cherry tomatoes here if we didn't take the time to replenish the soil. But in this bed, we're growing 3 different types of cherry tomatoes. We are growing, actually, I guess 4 now that I think about it. We're growing Sweet Millions. We are growing the Yellow Pear. We are also growing Dancing with Smurfs. And then that tomato that you see right there, that's the fourth one. And I forgot it because we just picked it up from our Master Gardener sale. We were up there. We like to go see what they have each year. And they had an orange cherry tomato, which I have never grown before, so I wanted to give it a shot. Now, our cherry tomatoes are absolutely fantastic. Last year, we got more cherry tomatoes than we've ever gotten before, and it was just from the Sweet Million, which we're growing 4 plants of those this year, which is exactly what we grew last year. But we're adding a little bit of color to it because I like the idea of having snack cherry tomatoes where I can just kind of throw them in a bowl and I have a lot of different colors. It seems like that would be really appealing. But something we did last year for the first time that kind of changed my mind on cherry tomatoes was we roasted them much like we do our Roma tomatoes and froze them just because we had so many. We wanted to see what would happen. We took those dudes out in the wintertime and they are absolutely phenomenal. Just putting them over, taking them, cook the juice out of them until they're nice and sweet, and then put them over some buttered pasta or something in the wintertime, and it tastes just like summer. I say that because from now on, we will not only have frozen Roma tomatoes, but we will also have frozen cherry tomatoes. They are superb. So in this bed, you can see I also have not mulched this either. I was also waiting for the rain on this bed. So we have bags of that leaf mold that we made in the fall. There's a video on the channel about it if you care to see it. But we'll go through and we'll mulch all of this now that it's, we got like 3 inches of rain, so everything is nice and wet. So we'll put that leaf mold over the top of it and it'll help hold all that moisture in for the rest of the year. The other thing you can see that we've done this year with our cherry tomatoes is we grew basil and marigolds. Both are supposed to assist with cutting down on the overall pest problem. One of the reasons that we did decide to sort of spread our tomatoes out after the first couple years is because the pest pressure here in 7B, Arkansas, and I don't know if it's because we're close to the river or what, but the pest pressure here is insane at certain parts of the year. So we want to try all avenues to try to save our tomato plants as we can. Part of that is diluting them, in the rest of your garden. Other things are companion plants, and then we have DE and other things that we use. But growing our cherry tomatoes this year, you can see we have these bamboo stakes that we put in, and I measured them out at 9 feet, and then of course, sunk about 18 to 24 inches in the ground. But last year when we grew them in the pallet garden, they were just massive. All we used last year were those tomato cages, and those plants had to be 7-8 foot tall if they were standing up straight, and that was because I had to trim them off because they were growing out of the bed and the chicken were eating them all. So this year I wanted to put them away from the chickens, and I just want to see how tall we can get them. So as you can see, what I did was here, I left a little room on the back side of the trellis here so that if these do exceed, the height that I have of these, I can always put a larger piece of bamboo on the back side and secure it to the rails. That way, to heck with it. We'll see how tall they want to grow and just give them as much room as they want. Also, I just want to point this out. The reason that we have this setup is we have some hemp twine that we use to tie our tomatoes with. And as they grow, what we'll do is we'll run the twine horizontal through here and weave it into the branches of the cherry tomatoes. They seem to like that sort of trellising the cherry tomatoes do because they're like a vining type. Also because they're an indeterminate, they're going to grow all summer. So it's really easy having them in a setup like this to just strip off the parts the tomato no longer uses towards the bottom of the plant itself. And that's going to help you prevent a lot of the diseases and things that come through areas with high humidity like we have here. Specifically, if you get those limbs off when the plant is done with it, it's a really good way to try to avoid getting blight. I mentioned earlier that we space our tomatoes throughout the gardens in the yard just to make sure we avoid an abject disaster. And that's true. However, we have recently been excluding the old garden in this, only because it doesn't get quite as much sun in the early part of the summertime. So after last year and as hot as it got, I started wondering if maybe if we use the old garden on years when it's super hot, maybe it can take some of the pressure off of those tomatoes, putting it in the old garden. So we did plant some, and let's go take a look. So this year we're utilizing this trellis for some additional cherry tomatoes. As I said earlier, the cherry tomatoes that we roast and froze were fantastic. So we're trying to get as many of those this year as we can. Last year on this trellis, we grew some winter squash, and it didn't do quite as well as we had hoped. It could have been the weather last year, but we've moved our winter squash to a different place to try to see how well that does. The idea that we're having here is that we would like these cherry tomatoes to grow over the top of this cattle panel. So again, because they're indeterminate, who knows how tall these cherry tomatoes can get by the end of the year, but we're going to try to find out. The only thing I'm hoping doesn't happen is I hope they don't reach the top of the trellis and then start growing up as opposed to down and towards the west. If that does happen, I'll just have to try to tie them down with some of that same hemp stuff that we use for the other tomatoes. But what we're hoping is that we can get enough cherry tomatoes off of this to also freeze. Just a quick pointer that, here we also added some basil in, we have some zinnias, and then just for intercropping purposes, I put in about 15 or 20 onions right through here, and those will be out well before any of the basil or the cherry tomatoes need the room. I also wanted to point out that because of where this garden sits, after the last rain, these beds were wet enough where I could go ahead and use that leaf mold. And this is what it looks like as the rain hits it. All it does really is hold water in. It keeps the sun directly off of your soil. So overall, it's a good thing to use. Just make sure that you use it sparingly and you don't crowd out your plants too much. So the final tomato beds that we'll look at now are here in our new Vajiga raised bed. We just put this in earlier in the spring. When we first put it in, we grew some greens in them. They were delicious. You can see we still have some of our onions remaining in there that we're going to use. But what we did here is we've put in 4 more Roma tomatoes. You can tell, see, I put the larger ones that we had in the back and the 2 small ones in the front. That's just because of the sun orientation to them. The idea here is that I have the onions that I had left, and then we put in some jalapeno peppers down here. So I'm hoping that I can take some of these Roma tomatoes and some of those jalapenos with those onions, and maybe we can make our own salsa from a bed like this. I've never really made salsa before. I'm not a huge fan of spicy foods, but I've had a lot of requests for it, and if we get the extra tomatoes and they happen to ripen at the same time as the jalapenos, I think I would really like to try my hand at making and canning some salsa. Let me know in the comments below what kind of tomatoes you folks are growing this year. As always, I appreciate you all hanging out with us. Till next time, I hope everybody takes care of themselves. Peace.